I kind of like the episodes where there's like one central theme because I can usually explain it almost like in one statement. But for this particular episode, I don't get that privilege because there's a bunch of things that need to sort of be mentioned. So, stuff like, sex, spirituality, like relationships, but also like what guys do and shit. Like, it's a massive mix of things, but all in all, it's going to revolve around relationships and sex, just to kind of make it seem a little bit more concise. But at least for the most part, it's not going completely off the rails. I want to try and play it a little bit safe on this episode and, just try to not talk about anything too controversial. And to start things off in a way that isn't as controversial, I'm going to talk about France for a little bit. Now, France very recently appointed its youngest and first openly gay prime minister, and his name is Gabriel Attal. Or at least that's how I'm hoping it's been pronounced, because I do not want to butcher the name Gabriel, which, does not sound like a name a French person would give to another French person. But all in all, he has been appointed as France's youngest prime minister and also first openly gay prime minister, which is a little bit odd and it does raise a couple of questions, and I'll address some of them. It's just that out of all the replies and comments and questions that were being brought up, the one thing that I never saw asked or having an answer for is, considering that he's married to a man and he is a man, who exactly gets to be the first man in that entire thing? Or is it second? Because, both of them are dudes. So, normally there'd be a first lady. So, in this particular case, I don't know if you're kind of feeling me on this, but are you getting the confusion?
The royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Okay, I know, maybe talking about him being the first openly gay isn't really something that should be spoken about, because it's not like we usually talk about the president as an openly straight president. But at the end of the day, you kind of have to think about how people still look at the LGBT, and how having an openly gay person taking up some sort of senior position can probably, increase NGO funding or, drive up some criticisms and responses some way. But normally, I'd have expected that sort of response to come from the more conservative side of, global politics and shit. So, the Africas and the Asias and the Middle East and all. But the West, I'm even wondering why the West is calling this person the first openly gay. I bet there's a bunch of people who are closeted gay that are actually in power, but they'll never really admit it because, of course, closeted. But still, the affairs of what he does in his bedroom with whoever it is he chooses to do it with shouldn't really be something that should be attached to his powerful position. But all in all, let me just read the small caption that came with the entire post. So it says, and I quote, Gabriel Attal, the current education minister, will become the youngest person to occupy France's second highest office at 34 years old. In France, the prime minister leads the government and is appointed by but cannot be directly dismissed by the president. Attal, a close ally to French President Emmanuel Macron, is the most popular government minister, polls suggest. He will be the first openly gay prime minister of France. End quote. And like I said, him being openly gay, not really our problem. If we knew that he was, as one of the fun facts, that would probably work. But first openly gay prime minister, nah, that's not something that I'm totally feeling. Granted, maybe the fact that he can take a dick or two means that, he can handle a couple of dicks in parliament and shit like that. But the more unfortunate side of this entire thing isn't the fact that people will focus on the fact that he's the youngest prime minister that France has ever had, but just the fact that he's openly gay. People will be talking about shit at least the guy knows either how to be a pain in the ass or handle people who can be a pain in the ass. And you're like, why the hell would you say that? But at the same time, there's someone else who's busy saying, he clearly knows how to handle things that can be long and hard. A prime minister's position. So get your mind out the gutter. And at that point, that's when I'd want to get out of the discussion so that I don't continue making fun of this man and probably start the podcast, because that's a little bit more important to me. So to add a bit more color than a French flag, let me just say, welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who knows how to be a pain in the ass. Not that he's tried, but... okay, this is kind of screwing me over, isn't it? He is a man who believes that astrology should have been the study of us. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. That intro could have fucked me royally, kinda like the French Prime. Anyways, I'm done making jokes about the French Prime Minister. I think that's a little bit excessive. People should be talking about his youth, not his capability to take dick. Because at this point, if one of his first agendas is to stop drug trafficking in France, we might just end up calling his reign the French Connection. But that's not a joke that most people would probably get. But all in all, I'm sure there's someone that's probably tired of me making jokes about France, and someone who wants us to continue with the podcast. And at this point, I would say we. So moving things on, considering that this is a Friday episode, it is an episode where I usually like to go into the internet and pick apart some of the opinions that some of you guys put up online, more so on X. And usually I invite you, the listener, to contribute the many tweets that you see that you feel that should be discussed on this podcast, so that I can take them and handle them accordingly. And the drill on how to do it is pretty simple, almost sounds like a song, and it goes like this. You see that tweet, you like that tweet, you want us to discuss that tweet, you send that tweet. You send it to the DMs of @BagakaTheD, which happens to be my personal X handle, and I will take it from there and handle it accordingly. On Facebook and on IG, if it happens to be a screenshot, a screen grab, or it ended up on a reel, then the place to send it to is @thebreaktime_podcast on IG and @thebreaktime_podcast on Facebook, and I will take it from there and handle it accordingly. Now, I have a couple of tweets that I need to get into, but before I can do any of that, I want us to first go into a little bit of spirituality. And no, I'm not bringing religion into this. Actually, I kind of am, but not in the way that some of you guys might be thinking. So, there was a clip that I saw of a pastor who was busy talking about getting rid of soul ties. Now, I'm usually very skeptical on the idea of soul ties and people trading energies during sex, but considering that there are some people who have some interesting views on this, I was curious to know what it is a pastor could say about this entire thing. So I got the clip, I listened to it, and I want you to listen to it as well before I can give my thoughts on it. So without further ado,
this is how you break soul ties. Number one, you must open your mouth and cancel and declare. Let me take an example of me. Let's assume possibly I had 3 girlfriends. I had Mary, I had Jane, and maybe I had Faith. And maybe all of them I slept with them. So how do I break these soul ties? Number one, I must confess and say, Father, in the name of Jesus, I break every entanglement between me and Mary, every entanglement between me and Faith, every entanglement. That's how you break them. And guess what? You break them by faith. The same way you made the sinner's prayer by faith. This is how we are going. You break them by faith. And then after breaking them by faith, you begin to declare who you are in Christ. What are you doing? Where there was a vow, you are releasing a statement of who you are in Jesus Christ. I don't know, because I know we are in different levels in our faith. I know some of us, these are not issues that affect you, but some of us, because of the level that they are in, we have to deal with these things so that people become free and people begin to enjoy salvation, and the joy of salvation becomes their portion.
okay, so I don't want to sound like a complete skeptic or to completely make fun of everything that he's saying, because I can't really say for sure if he's right or wrong. It's just, how exactly would he know if the soul tie has been broken or not? Or even just you, the person that would probably take his advice. How exactly would you know that the soul tie is broken or not? And also, why is he approaching it almost like an exorcism? To a certain degree, because it almost sounds like he's trying to chase away a demon that is holding on to your soul and shit like that, because you have to rebuke it and you have to declare that you are breaking all entanglements. I'm not saying that he's completely wrong or he's completely right or even anything close to that. It's just, I've never fully understood the whole idea of soul ties and having spiritual energies swapped with people. Mostly because whenever people talk about it, it's usually in the negative light. I've never heard someone talking about, exchanging soul ties with a positive person and having it better them. It's usually just, this person had negative energy, this person had the spirit of depression and shit like that. And all of a sudden it's like, this is such a bad thing. Of which it seems like it can work as a way to deter, Christians and people who tend to be spiritual from, having meaningless sex and everything. But beyond that, it does really come into question. Because I personally think that if indeed soul ties do exist, then you'd probably at least want to know that there's a way of breaking them that you can actually check to see if they're broken. Because if you're talking about being attracted to that person again, that could just be a case of being pussy whipped or being dick whipped. It could just be a case of you being attracted to the person or to the features of the person, which is, mostly just a case of lust, which I don't think is entirely that bad. I think it's what people do in the name of lust that is usually particularly bad. But all in all, I still find it quite weird that someone is busy talking about breaking soul ties and they're a pastor, because I don't think that falls under doctrine to talk about soul ties. Soul ties sounds like very, very woke language, because most people who started talking about soul ties and exchanging energies are people who are particularly woke, are people who tend to be, really into spiritual shit, and that usually isn't the religious kind. So to find a pastor talking about it seems a little bit more modern. It's just, I don't entirely trust what's being said. I don't think he can measure it. I don't think he can even for certain say that there is such a thing as soul ties. So for the most part, whatever he's giving us isn't entirely what I'd call true. It's just a practice that he thinks could work, but isn't for certain sure that it could. Otherwise, if there was a way that we could have seen soul ties, we could have been finding ways to get rid of that shit. But, then again, maybe I am wrong about this entire thing. Maybe you shouldn't listen to my advice. You should probably listen to him. But either way, I'm going to leave it at that and get into the tweets. So, on to our very first tweet of this episode. Now, this particular tweet was written up by a guy, and it seems like the guy was either Nigerian or just generally West African, because there are some things that did sort of seem a little bit hard to pronounce or even translate, but I'll just try and read it out as best I can. So he says, and I quote, "Walk with me, guys. As a struggling guy earning 80 to 100k monthly, you meet a babe, you have a game, you raise her good with good communication, you guys go out on a small date to a cinema. 7k per ticket, 14k for both of you, your bold trip to and fro consumed like 15k, miscellaneous of 5k, you've spent a total of 34k. You're guiding your remaining 66k for feeding, data and transportation and savings. You both had a nice time, everybody goes back to their houses and you keep communicating for the next 3 weeks before you can see her again. On the other hand, there's another guy that took her for a date night, bought her flowers, tells the chef to do a write-up on the plate, I love you so much XOXO, drops her off, they had a nice time. 2 days later, he texts her, I thought about you so I sent you some box of chocolates. You both have good intentions towards her, but it kind of looks like you are unserious. Healthy relationships and shit." End quote. Alright, so the weird part about this is a lot of people who are busy talking about intentionality, and people like bringing this whole thing of, I like a guy who's intentional and shit. And every time whenever I see people talk about stuff like this and they give examples like this, I usually like to point out that it's a bit of a slippery slope, because I don't think both of these guys did anything wrong. Both of them took different approaches to the same girl, and assuming that they both used the same amount of money total, then you could say that both guys actually did something good. One might appeal more to one kind of woman versus another, and the same is on the other end, because there are some women who will want something that is, a little bit more gift oriented. So you'll find that you sending the box of chocolates makes you seem more desirable to her. There's also another woman that'll be like, I like the frequent communication that we have, even though I'm not being sent a box of chocolates, because maybe she just prefers constant communication as opposed to sending a box of chocolates and not constantly communicating with her for like the entire day. And both of those are particularly correct. I don't think there's a wrong answer towards who did what better than the other. And I don't even think either one did one better than the other. But the reality of it is, when it comes to dating a woman, in light of the different dating strategies that people can employ, I don't think there's usually a wrong answer to this. Because there's a guy that can decide to pick her up in a nice dress and take her for a dinner date at Harvest where they can have tomahawk steak and like have it with glasses of wine and a bunch of other shit, and they end up blowing like 20 grand. But there's another guy that'll pick her up over the weekend and take her on a small road trip and then have a picnic with her where he's got, a couple of nice bottles of wine, some well-prepped food and shit, and it can come down to the same exact cost. Okay, maybe not the full 20 grand, maybe call it 10 on both ends, but still, like, the costs could be the same, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be taken the same when it's going to be appreciated, one better than the other. Because there's some people that like extravagant, there's some people that like something that's a little bit more small and intimate, without any flashy show of luxury or anything like that, just something well thought out. So, to be quite honest, there isn't any real right or wrong in this entire thing. It's just who chooses a strategy that appeals more to one woman or another. Because there's some women that will choose the let's go on a simple date and just chill together, and we can continue talking as the weeks go by, because it's an entire month till you get paid, and probably you've blown most of your disposable income on her, and she's okay with the communication. There's others that will prefer the random gifts, or at least the periodic gifts that show that you still care about her. There's some that will prefer a nice intimate picnic. There's others that will prefer to be taken at a nice extravagant place. Like, at the end of the day, each of them is going to want things a little bit differently and prefer one guy over the other. And there's also some women that preferred both, so they decide to fuck both of them. So they decide who it is that's better based on the quality of dick that they received. So at the end of it, there isn't really a right answer to this. It's just down to your dating strategies and what it is that the woman wants or prefers. And if she chooses to be with you, then cool. If not, then there's other women that will definitely appreciate the kind of gesture that you give. At the end of the day, just try and be as creative as possible as a guy, but don't be too creative that you take away from the fact that a date is pretty much you trying to find out if this woman is a good partner for you, and vice versa, that you end up doing some shit that is an experience rather than a bonding time for the both of you, so that you can learn about each other. But then again, I haven't gone on a ton of dates lately, so I'm just gonna leave it at that and move it on to our very next tweet of this episode. Now, this was written up by a woman, and it said, and I quote, "We don't talk nearly enough about paper cuts in a relationship. Every time there's raised voices, cruel words, lack of support, short temper, lack of affection, etc., a tiny wound is created. Not enough to make you leave, but enough to make a part of you pull away and lose a little love every time. One day those wounds create a chasm so deep it's unfixable. What isn't a big deal to you today could be a chasm tomorrow. Nurture your partner. Walk with gentleness and apologize freely. It's easier than living with the regret at the edge of a chasm." End quote. Okay, to be very honest, I don't entirely agree with this, because I believe that after you've had a spout and you've had an argument with your partner, y'all at least talk stuff out and you learn to forgive each other and possibly agree to change. So by the time this is building up, you're clearly just forgiving, not forgetting, and you're allowing it to build up, and it ends up hurting you. Of which, if that's what you want to do as a woman or as women, then at this point, frankly, I think that's a you problem, because us guys, we learn to take our shit. If there's a problem, we sort it out, we forget about the problem, and we move on. And after I've said stuff like this the entire time, someone would think that I'd stop it there, except that I understand that people talk about forgiveness in relationships and learning to let things go, but everything that this woman has said is right. Like, yes, there are paper cuts, and using even the paper cuts analogy, they are cuts that heal. It's a tiny cut, it's a tiny pain, it's a tiny wound, but if someone repeats the same thing over and over again, even though you continuously forgive them, it's not like the wound is gone. It continues to remain. And the more they continue to cut into it, the more it hurts, the more annoying it becomes, and eventually it can end up forcing a reaction from the other person, which could be as a result of resentment, which could just be as a result of them trying to pull away, or it could just be them just completely being fed up with you. And at that point, if it's the babe who's fed up with you, that's usually the time when they start checking out of the relationship. So, you're kind of in that relationship, but you're mostly in that relationship alone as a guy. She's busy looking for other people while she's in that relationship with you. Or, something close to that. But all in all, before it gets to that point, always listen and speak to each other. And if you notice that there's a bad habit, either call it out, or if you're the one that's being called out, learn from it and try to change, so that you can be a much better partner to your person and, hopefully vis-a-vis. But then again, maybe people can't change. Maybe some things can't be taken face down, or, people should just learn to forgive each other and forget about that shit. Either way, I am willing to let most of that shit go up until a point. So I am going to leave it at that and move it on to our very final tweet of this episode. So it was actually a reply. And the original tweet was actually a question that had been asked. So the question was, and I quote, "When a man is handsome, educated, has money but is still single, what could be the problem?" End quote. And the reply that we have here is, the problem is people thinking a relationship is the reason we look for money and an education. Some of us just want to afford the lives we aspire to live. Milkshake at Camel's Joint and seafood at Tamarind. End quote. Okay. So this tweet is actually very, very good in terms of showing people that the mindsets of a lot of us in society are actually very similar. And a lot of times people tend to think that they're different, and yet they're not as different as you might think. Because here's the thing. With a lot of guys, people might assume that there's a problem. But of course, a lot of guys do make money, do look good, and they're handsome and they're educated. But it's not like they're eyeing a relationship sometimes because they were heartbroken and they don't feel like getting into a relationship, or they have so many options that, they don't feel like getting into a relationship, so they'd much rather fuck around. And there's some people who just don't even know how to approach women, so even though they have all of these things, they don't have the social skills to go and hit on a babe. And then there's other guys that just don't really give a shit about any of that because that's not even their interest. Maybe they're interested in gaming or cars or some shit, so they just, work on that. They'd much rather invest themselves into that and not into a relationship. And that's all perfectly okay. Guys do that. It's kind of the same way when a lot of women are asked why it is they're not married or trying to have kids in like their late 20s or their 30s or even their 40s. And they're like, it's not like I did all of this just so that I can get married and have kids and just stay at home. Some of them want to make the money so that they can travel and fulfill their dreams of going to a certain number of countries or to certain countries. Or they want to build something for themselves and, that has gotten them to where they're at, and they're continuing to work towards that before they even think of having a family. At the end of it, you can't really compound everyone's reasoning for choosing to do what it is that they do or for doing everything that they've done and then say that it should all just be for, getting into a relationship, getting married and having some kids. That's not the reason that everyone else chooses to do what they choose to do. Sometimes people aren't interested in that. Sometimes people just want to get all of those things so that they can actually fulfill their own goals and their own dreams and aspirations even before they think about, the concept of having a relationship and kids and all. And, this is something that a lot of women, with like the whole rich auntie vibes have been fighting a lot of guys on. And they're like, oh, why do you guys think in such a one-dimensional way? Well, clearly we can see that women can also think in a one-dimensional way. There's a lot of women that say stuff like this. I remember even when I was a kid, like 9-10 years ago, I was talking to our maid at home and she had this same idea. And at the time I was like, I just want to make some money so I can get myself nice shit. And she's like, nah, you make money and then you just go and you look for a wife and, you get a kid and you settle down and shit. But clearly, not everyone has the same idea of how life should be lived. Although, then again, maybe I'm wrong and people do still need to do that, whether before or after they chase a bunch of these other things they say they want. But either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On X, it is at BagakaTheD. On Facebook, it is at The Breaktime Podcast. And on IG, it is at The Breaktime_podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.